So racial justice, migrant justice, social justice, all of the justices that we often talk about are all connected. And a Green New Deal really needs to have that kind of intersectional lens to develop policies and technologies and things like that that are truly equitable and a just solution. And we need to have those conversations to ensure that we are avoiding things like eco-fascism or policies that are only benefiting certain parts of the community, or even worse, like discriminating against others. Can I have the next slide? So we know that in a crisis, our most precarious communities feel the effects first and experience the most significant impacts. So that can include people that are experiencing homelessness and poverty, migrant workers, people with disabilities, BIPOC communities, and others. So we need to actively create policies and programs that dismantle colonialism and injustice and increase funding and services for everyone. One of the big failures of FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, while it has many great things about it, was how its policies further cemented injustices through policies like redlining, which kind of caused racist policies to be developed into housing and the way that neighborhoods were developed. And so we can really learn from the mistakes of FDR's New Deal as we're developing a Green New Deal that enshrines dignity and justice for everyone. So one issue I'm going to start us off with is decarceration and prison abolition. So when natural disasters or crises hit, incarcerated people are among the first that are left behind or have their bodies put on the line in high-risk labor. So by high-risk labor, I mean, like, for example, in California, inmates were forced to, they may have not been forced to, I believe it. So again, but anyway, they were working to do firefighting in the area and at very, very low pay. And then to make matters more insulting, after they were released, they were not able to be hired as firefighters despite that experience. And prison structures inherently leave prisoners unable to adapt or seek different shelter, which exponentially increases their vulnerability to extreme weather or to the spread of disease. So what does it really take for a community to feel cared for and safe? Some examples can include like food security, housing, education, and a basic income. And we know that most criminal offenses typically come from not having access to these things. So things happen, but as a result of those not having access to those. And so investing in them has been shown to dramatically reduce the number of offenses in a community. So we know that by investing in care workers and public service instead of policing of prisons, we can develop communities that are safer, happier, and more climate resilient. So to bring that back to COVID, for an example, right now prisoners are unable to practice precautions around social distancing and disinfection and things like that. Historically, disease spreads rapidly in prisons due to proximity and reduced access to healthcare and limited access to outside supports. So by dismantling the prison system and moving towards decarceration, we can both create a community that is more resilient to crises and climate change and the climate crisis, as well as have a more just and caring society. Can I have the next slide, please? So we all deserve good jobs and labor rights and access to universal services like healthcare and education and income security. Also, many of us and many sectors really depend on migrant workers. And the climate crisis is forcing people from their homes. This has already started and it's only going to continue to get worse. Between 2008 and 2016, 227 million people were displaced due to extreme weather events. And the United Nations forecasts that between 25 million and 1 billion people will be environmental migrants by 2050. So we need to adapt. We need to think about the way that we move and the way that migration is dealt with. Currently, immigration systems are structured in a way that denies rights and equalities. So for example, skilled workers, however that a government defines that, are granted permanent resident status and rights that come along with that, while care workers and farm workers are given temporary status. And these kind of distinctions, while they vary in different countries and communities, will deny them things like labor law protection or healthcare and other rights that come with permanent citizenship. So a Green New Deal really needs to include good, fair jobs for all. And so that really means living wages and labor rights like paid sick leave and not having an employer-specific or time-limited work permit. And we need universal services. So accessing healthcare and education and income security, access to childcare and pensions for all of us, not just those that have a particular status on their citizenship. And we need to also give status to all migrants and refugees. And so that means no detentions or deportations. And so bringing that back to COVID again, migrant workers right now are unable to access government financial supports like the CERB. They have limited access to healthcare, and being laid off or losing their job during the pandemic not only impacts their economics, but it can also impact their status and their ability to stay in the country if they're just a temporary worker. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. And so a Green New Deal really needs to be developed based on the needs of a community. So while these are two examples that are applicable to any society, we also have to think about the needs of each specific community as we develop Green New Deal policies. So for example, a Green New Deal for Alberta doesn't look the same as what a Green New Deal for the Northwest Territories would look like, for example. Each community experiences different pressures, different cultural and political norms, and solutions under a Green New Deal needs to reflect that. So as we continue this conversation, I encourage you to think about what are some of the challenges that your community faces or that you are seeing as we go through current life, and how might a Green New Deal be adapted to suit that. And I'll pass it off to Chen.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and for grounding our conversation today. I'd like to just at front to acknowledge that this topic is difficult, this topic is messy, this topic is uncomfortable, and it takes a lot of humility, self-reflection, and desire to approach this topic. So it's really just unrealistic for anybody to even attempt to summarize anything remotely conclusive in 15 minutes. So I just need to put out there saying that what will be said here today just reflects on, where I am at as a visitor, as a settler on this land at this particular juncture of my life. So anything I said here should not be seen as fixed truth, but just one way to make sense, to ground ourselves and think about the important accountability we owe to the land and its people. So I hope that some of the questions I raised can make some of us just think for a second. It would be great. And when considering this topic, there are 5 important sets of tensions and questions I want to briefly touch upon today when it comes to envisioning what a Green New Deal looked like for Alberta or for elsewhere for that matter. So my understanding of these tensions, I have to acknowledge also greatly benefit from countless interactions between me and many indigenous scholars, teachers, activists across North America, and including those in Treaty 6 territory. So next slide, please, Batul. As Danielle just mentioned, one of the 4 non-negotiable pillars of a Green New Deal here says respect indigenous rights. But I'm afraid that this is easier said than done. And Danielle, at the start of this webinar, acknowledged the land. And that's a practice we encourage everybody to start to practice in different occasions. But right now, I want to invite you to take a moment to acknowledge another thing: the hardship and hard work of your ancestors, your families, and yourself to make you where you are at today. Let's take a moment to acknowledge that, especially considering that we're in a time where, you know, some people died without having the chance to see their families. Similarly on this land. What I want to say here is that I believe few people come to the land with the hope of a better life, intended to enact violence and injustice to other people. However, no matter what our intention of arrival is, our presence here on this land, unfortunately, is bolstering the white supremacist state and an economy based on industrial extractivism of the dispossessed indigenous land. So to some extent, settlers are unfortunate victim of the colonial system too, because in a sense that it deprived us of a sense of humility and humanity. So next slide, please, Batul. A lot of times we talk about colonialism as in political structures, as in social institutions. But right now, I invite everybody to look at this definition by Potawatomi scholar Kyle White. He conceptualized colonialism as closely related to the occupation of physical space, terrestrial, aquatic, and aerial places, but also a disruption of the pre-existing relationships indigenous people had already established with plant, animals, and physical entities. So I want all of us to think about what this definition can convey in addition to what we consider as the conventional definition of colonialism. The literal replacement and plantation of goods, of plants, animals, so on and so forth. Next slide, please, Batul. So the first question and tension I want to bring out here is that how can indigenous rights be respected? Because throughout history, it seems that respect remains as a token at best when invoked by settlers. It is still much easier said than done today. I ask, if you have violently occupied somebody's ancestral home, attempted to erase their body and desecrate the physical space, how well can you respect the rights of the host? Next slide, please, Batul. So I want to introduce what scholars Heather Davis and Zoe Todd provided here as a nuanced insight on what essentially colonialism does. They said that colonialism really severs relations between people and land, between people and people. Therefore, when we consider the notion of genocide happening on this land, it's not only about genocide of humans, but also all their kinships, animals and plants. Next slide, please. So the second set of tension and question here, therefore, is when we talk about respect, we need to first ground ourselves where we are as the center of respect, like who we are. If, like the tension number 2 here, when our vision of good life definitely involves with what we do with the land, how we use resource, and for what purpose, is in general in clash with that of the indigenous peoples. Not to say that indigenous people have an identical understanding of good life, but we can say that the settlers' vision and version of a good life is in conflict with what was previously established here. So the second question is, are we really talking about respect indigenous people's rights, or also about reflecting back our own narrow view of relations, including human and human land relations? Next slide, please, Fatua. So here comes the important notion of decolonization. A number of indigenous scholars have talked about, and activists have talked about the notion of decolonization. I want to first say that this notion has been used differently in different colonial contexts. For example, this notion has been used to describe a historical period where a lot of Asian and African former colonies gained political independence in the middle of the 20th century. Yet, in settler colonial context, in the context of a lot of indigenous communities and their struggles, there is a need to understand decolonization as, for example, as the bullet points shows here, it's about reestablishing self-governance for indigenous peoples, restitution of its stolen land, reparations for the descendants of captured Africans in North America. But importantly, fundamentally question the bounds and legitimacy of a nation state structure itself. As you can see, I have a picture of a pie here. I like to use this metaphor of a colonial pie. I also have one in my hand. You can see it's a colonial pie. So normally, settler sides of the society understand justice for indigenous people is just giving them a bigger slice of the pie, because they always want just a bigger slice of the pie. And following that logic, indigenous people are just another minority group, just like African Americans, Black community, just like Asian communities, just like sexual minorities, just like the disabled communities. What we can do is not questioning how this pie came about, who made it, what process all the resources of our society is gathered and processed and distributed. But just thinking about the final stage, the final step, just carving out, cutting the pie. Next slide, please. Yes, so I think a lot of times, even those seemingly green projects, seemingly eco-friendly projects such as hydro dams, such as carbon trading schemes, they're essentially not alternative to what is required when we consider indigenous sovereignty and decolonization. That is to fundamentally question the existing dominating framework, how our society is organized. Next slide, please, Batu. So here, I put here, decolonization is not a metaphor. If we think back onto the cake or the pie, we'll have to understand that what decolonization means is not just recutting the pie, but questioning who made the pie. Where did the material of the pie coming from? What happened when the pie is made? And through what process can all the nutrients that the pie provides can be justice for all the people on this land? So as you can see, tension number 3 here, we tend to simplify respecting indigenous rights as only about resource redistribution within the current frameworks. Therefore, question number 3, can a Green New Deal respect indigenous rights without envisioning a future that is alternative to current institutions? Next slide, please. Yeah, I think Danielle already kind of touched upon this. It's the harsh reality that, the effect of climate change does not stay locally, does not stay within the confines of an artificial border. It flows as the extractive industry projects from global north countries like Canada is flowing to other parts of the world, have negative impacts in other parts of the world. So here we have tension number 4. I cite this notion of global ecological debt, meaning that historically certain societies, certain sections of global north have historically benefited from their carbon emission due to their industrialization. Therefore, people in other parts of the world, certain communities are in a disadvantaged position. Therefore, we can say that there's a debt relationship here, socially and ecologically. So here we comes to tension number 4. Social ecological debt, not confined locally to the province or to the artificial border of the country. And then it prompts us to ask, who are the indigenous peoples we're talking about? Just in Alberta, just in Canada, or just in global north? How well are we respecting rights of indigenous peoples in global south who have been generationally suffering as a result of highly inequitable international economic system? Then we can move to the next slide. It's pretty straightforward. Oh, what can I do? I think as we confront this type of tensions, questions, many of us really wants to know some quick, smooth, easy solutions to fix the problem ASAP without questioning our fundamental views about the world, our position and relationship to the land and its people. So I asked in question number 5, if respecting indigenous rights entails decolonization, sacrificing or even abandoning settler infrastructure or privilege accrued through colonialism. Are we still cool with it? Are we still respecting it? Or it's too difficult for us to respect that? Next slide, please, Batul. Oh, I got a bonus, not just 5, not just 5. I gotta conclude this with a bonus. So all I have said sounds pretty uncomfortable, sounds pretty unsettling, sounds pretty hard. A lot of times, the harsh reality and the circumstances we face on a daily basis put us into a tension position. We either deny colonialism as if nothing happened, or we succumb to pessimism as if we can do nothing. I think this is kind of a result of colonialism, because colonialism wants us to make us believe that we can do nothing because colonialism is triumphing, is in victory, is winning. So I think it's really important for us to seek alternative ways to look at some of the things, understanding even the fact that we're talking about some issue right now is a result of generations, decades, if not centuries of hard work of indigenous people and non-indigenous people that bring some of the issues to light so that we can begin to engage it within this current moment. So with that said, I have last question. My last question is, can we be neutral after we learn all this? This question comes from what African-American activist Angela Davis once in a discussion about being racist or anti-racist. Angela Davis believed that you can't be neutral. You're racist or you're anti-racist. So here I'm asking, can we be neutral? Can we say I'm not a colonizer? Or alternatively, we can say maybe the other option is just actively challenging colonialism. And each of us right here in this room, I believe, have unique power based on where we are at, our positions, our skill set, our networks to enact and help restore the relationships we talked about earlier. Restoring the relational accountability and actively working towards what decolonization demands of us and stand with indigenous peoples in this fight and make sure that Green New Deal has accounted for some of the things discussed here. And with that, I will hand over to Allison.
Hi, everyone. So the last thing that we're going to really focus on, acknowledging that there's so many different aspects of, oh no. The tool. There we go. So the last thing that we're going to focus on today is eco-fascism. A lot of you know me personally, and you know that this is something that I love to talk about because I think that it's really important and that we see it a lot in even leftist or progressive or environmentalist communities. So I'm going to get into a little bit today what I mean by that, why it's something that's important and why it's something that's definitely changeable in our relationships. So it's hugely prominent in conversations about climate change and the environment, even in environmentalists. We've heard eco-fascist beliefs expressed at our Green New Deal workshops and in conversations with friends and family. So what is eco-fascism? It's a term that's been around for decades, but it gained prominence after the Christchurch mosque shooting in 2019 in New Zealand, where the shooter actually was a self-described eco-fascist, and it was part of his manifesto. Eco-fascism draws on authoritarian, fascist, neo-Malthusian policies and beliefs to address the climate crisis. It's an ideology that defends violent authoritarianism as necessary to protect the environment. Today I'm going to talk about why we need to address eco-fascism, how people express eco-fascist worldviews, and how we can stop that tendency in its tracks. So next slide. Thanks. So there's three main flavors that I've identified of eco-fascism. The first is as an idealized government type. That type thankfully doesn't exist, but it would be authoritarian in the name of the climate and the environment. The second type is a self-identified eco-fascist. And those people exist. They're a small but existing community. You can find them on Instagram. You can find them on the darker corners of the internet as well. But they're fairly mainstream, but again, a pretty small community. But third, and most prolifically, I see eco-fascism as an ideological tendency within environmentalist circles. And I see that pretty commonly, even amongst people who otherwise express a lot of, like, quote unquote progressive or leftist beliefs. Eco-fascism normalizes and accepts suffering from the climate crisis. It manifests in a lot of ways, like being okay with some people dying in the name of the climate crisis, accepting mass suffering under climate change as long as the economy keeps growing for the wealthy, a preference for strong borders and immigration controls for wealthy nations, a fixation on overpopulation, and a fixation on carrying capacity. It's exemplified by ecologist Garrett Hardin's Lifeboat Ethics, which you can sum up as what to do when a ship is carrying 100 passengers suddenly capsizes and there's only one lifeboat. For lifeboat ethics, that means that when the lifeboat is full, those who hate life, according to them, will try to load it with more people and sink the lot. And those who love and respect life, according to them, will take the ship's axe and sever the extra hands that cling to the sides. Prominent eco-fascists include the 2019 Christchurch mosque shooter, the 2019 El Paso shooter, and but even mainstream environmentalists like Jane Goodall have expressed beliefs around limiting the human population of the world in service of the climate, and that's, again, a concerning tendency. So next slide. Okay, but is that fascist? There's a lot of critiques about using the term, and there's a lot of very valid critiques about using a term with the word fascist in it. People don't like hearing that the things that they say have fascistic tendencies, and so it can close down conversation. There's also the critique that it's not really fascist, it's not eco-fascist, that's not its own thing, that instead what we're dealing with is liberal economics and capitalism, and that these are tendencies that are baked into that. Personally, I'm open to other suggestions for terminology that might be more accurate or open up more space for dialogue with people who hold these opinions. However, I think it's important to keep the eco in here because people with these opinions are often legitimately concerned with the environment and climate change. It's also using the climate crisis to pave the way for increasingly authoritarian governments and less humane responses. So we're on the right side now. There's a scientific consensus. So why is this important? There's a scientific consensus about anthropogenic climate change, and the scale of solutions need to meet the scale of the crisis. After decades of delay tactics, half measures, and inaction, the scale of the climate crisis is enormous, and the social and political changes we need to make will require huge changes, but those shouldn't come at the expense of people who already suffer the greatest effects of the climate emergency. It's absolutely true that every person has a carbon footprint. Humanity has a huge impact on the planet. That's the anthropogenic part of anthropogenic climate change. However, the problem is not with humanity in general, and it's not because there's too many people in poor countries, too many poor people in poor countries. A bigger problem is consumption by rich people in rich countries, as exemplified by this chart of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions by country. You can see the outsized effect of North America and Europe compared to other parts of the world. In particular, the problem is extractive industries, like where they get the carbon from, multinational corporations that dodge taxes and environmental regulations, and the ultra wealthy that make their money off of these industries. Next slide. So eco-fascist talking points like closing borders, population control, etc., don't come with adequate plans for reaching net zero emissions along the ambitious timeline science is demanding. To say this a different way, there is no sound environmentalist reason to pursue authoritarian, racist, and eugenicist policies, and they should lead us to wonder whether people who cite environmentalist justifications for these policies might just have had an authoritarian, racist, eugenicist instinct to begin with. The logic that some people are expendable to keep other people living as they please fits well into the extractive neoliberal capitalism that dominates global economies. For example, accepting that it's okay that some people, reading older people, those with pre-existing conditions, are going to die from COVID-19, so we should send people back to work even during a pandemic in order to save the economy, obviously at the expense of saving lives. Eco-fascism shows us that our big problem in tackling climate change isn't convincing people that it's real. Eco-fascism understands that climate change is real, and what it disagrees with is the political implications of that. On the left, we have failed to adequately ground justice in our conversations about climate change, and I think that's why there's so many people on the left whose magic bullet answers to climate change involve population control and a fortress or war mentality. What they are promising is protection from the ravages of the climate crisis for the right people, people who are typically healthy, wealthy, and white. We often hear that Alberta is going to be one of the best places to be as climate change worsens. Setting aside the very real ways in which the climate crisis threatens Alberta's water, agriculture, wildlife, etc., this perspective assumes that Alberta will be demographically more or less the same in the future. In order to keep it this way, you have to keep other people out. There is zero reason to assume that if our political leaders started to take climate change seriously, that they would do it in a progressive manner, or even in a particularly democratic one. Eco-fascism highlights that caring about climate change is not an inherently leftist belief, and that we are at risk of losing ground on this issue. Instead, eco-fascism highlights that in addition to a science-based approach to the climate crisis, we also need to actively combat supremacist logics. Supremacist logic expresses itself differently in different contexts. For example, we have white supremacy here in North America, there's Hindu supremacy in Modi's India, Jewish supremacy in Zionist Israel, and an eco-fascist mindset is okay with hierarchy, it's okay with exaggerated inequality, and implicitly believes that some people are inferior to others for reasons that are out of their control. Next slide, please. So a Green New Deal fits into this conversation because it calls for a reevaluation of the social contract about whose interests we consider in addressing the climate crisis. So Luke Darby in GQ, who had a really good article about this, said, will we ensure that those displaced by the rising seas enjoy a dignified quality of life or turn them away at our borders? Will we enforce cruelly rigid definitions of who belongs and who doesn't, as climate change prompts what will likely be the largest mass migration in human history, or build a society strong enough to welcome newcomers with open arms and generous public services? We need to center justice in our climate policies and in our Green New Deal, because we need to consider how these policies will impact communities most often left behind. Widespread eco-fascist thought serves as a reminder that we, as people who stand for a justice-based approach to climate change, need to be leaders in the journey to net zero. If we don't center justice in our organizing, our policy proposals, and our movements, we open the door to violent racist policies that increase inequality and do not adequately address climate change. Next slide, please. So how do we talk about this? In today's breakout, we're going to talk about how to have difficult conversations about the Green New Deal, about justice first environmental policy. I just talked through the ways in which eco-fascist beliefs in our communities and movements sets us up to fail environmentally and socially. But here are 3 ways I find effective to start these hard conversations. We'll do more in the breakouts altogether. So first off, you can start by saying climate change is already one of the biggest drivers of human migration. Everyone deserves to live a good life. It's the ultra wealthy, not the poor, who make that harder for everyone. People who have the largest carbon footprints are wealthy people in wealthy places. We need to make big changes in how we live instead of accepting that other people won't get to live at all. And while we're at it, and this is a personal one, but let's stop calling parents and aspiring parents breeders, because it sets up, you know, an anti-life way instead of treating parents as optimists. So anyway, I think we're going to move, next slide, I guess. I think we're going to move into the breakout sessions now. The breakout today is going to be making a plan to have a difficult conversation this week. It can be a conversation with a friend, with a family member, sorry about the Slack notifications, and with a group chat, one-on-one, whatever it's going to be. at a social distance, on the phone, on your WhatsApp, whatever it is. And we're going to talk through what you would say and what resources you want to share. Where are some gaps in your knowledge? How are you going to address that? And what are some things that are weighing heavily on your mind? I know that we talked through a lot of really tough stuff today, and I'm really grateful that you're all here for it. But I want to end by saying, like, this isn't a call out, but it's more of a call in to foster these conversations in a good way so that we can take them out into our organizing beyond this point. You know, all of us have probably said versions of the things that we were talking about deprogramming today, because everyone is on their journey to being a better person, a better friend, a better organizer, a better community member. So yeah, this is all coming from a place of everyone learning together, rather than it being something that's you know, we're the experts and all that kind of stuff. So let's break into breakout groups and get going with having a difficult conversation and how we think about that today. All right, so we're all back. Thank you so much. Can we get a very brief debrief from all of the leaders, and then we'll kind of do a couple of little next steps, and then we'll go on our merry ways. So I'm wondering, anyone who led a discussion group can jump in with a quick summary. Maybe Elsa?
And about kind of the defeatist ideology that breeds like saying, oh, it's good that the earth is recovering because of the coronavirus, and it's good that people are going to die and the population will decrease and all of that. Like, people aren't outright saying that, but kind of having those feelings behind how people are talking about the pandemic is not something we want to foster. And I think a lot of conversations about the pandemic, difficult conversations, but yeah, we talked about not feeding that tendency in our conversations, like if it gets brought up. And we talked about conversations with people we know, like our friends or maybe our coworkers, about Indigenous rights. We had somebody in our group who is a steel worker, and when they talk to their coworkers about it, it's kind of what they get back is like the mentality of like, oh, but like we're creating jobs for them and we're helping them, and kind of the mentality of like that white saviorism and sort of claiming a lot of responsibility for any way that like colonialism happens to positively affect Indigenous people in like the small picture, and ignoring how it negatively affects them in the big picture. And we talked about how inherently like not simple these topics of conversation are, and how it can be easy to get swept up in feeling the pressure of like condensing it into a simple belief and then leading the person that you're talking to your belief, as opposed to like trying to help them question their beliefs that could be harmful, which we think is a lot more effective and takes a lot of pressure off you as the person in the conversation. And then we talked about also, because it is a conversation, it's important to like acknowledge the validity of people's feelings, even if they're coming from like a harmful place or a harmful ideology. I think it, like, when you're having a conversation with a loved one about this, it can be great to like still be patient with them, and relating your experiences is a helpful conversational like strategy that was discussed. I think like that's helpful, and acknowledging the validity of people's feelings is helpful because it makes it more like a real conversation and less like preachy and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That sounds super interesting. How about Paige?
Yeah, totally. So we had a great discussion just talking about how appreciated it was to have that analysis on ecofascism as something that a lot of us are seeing coming up, and also like a solid reminder to be really engaged in decolonial practice and recognizing how much it structures the climate justice movement. Some of the things that we talked about were similar to what Elsa mentioned about like meeting folks where they're at. So someone brought up the Alberta Narratives Project and sort of the data that came out of that, of recognizing that there are strategic ways of talking about issues with folks, and often, yeah, that might look different than what emotionally we might be really drawn into arguing with someone, or yeah, obviously like tension can come up in these conversations, but we were talking about sort of, you know, spectrum of allies, conversations of trying to reach folks sort of in that middle, or finding common issues, things that you share, values maybe, and finding those ways to bring up other ideas that might be able to bring those folks a little bit further. We did definitely talk about how it can feel sometimes overwhelming, knowing that all of these different issues are facing us, and that we want to push on all of them, but knowing that there's only, you know, 24 hours in a day. But we talked a bit about how a Green New Deal can be really powerful for that, because it offers us solutions on so many of these interconnected things.
Thank you. That does sound really interesting. How about Chris G?
Hi. Yeah, we had a great conversation. Really cool to hear how the other conversations went as well. So sometimes you don't need to plan these difficult conversations. One of our group members just had one the other day at the family dinner table. So sometimes they just happen. But now we're all armed with more skills and tools for having those conversations. So one really good insight from our group was that rather than statements or accusations, questions are a really good way to proceed in a difficult conversation. So, you know, tell me more about that, or like, where do you think that might lead? So it's a way of forcing the person you're talking to kind of confront the logical conclusions over their ideas, and it's sort of disarming. Another good way to go in difficult conversations is personal stories. So a belligerent person or someone who is really in disagreement with you, they can challenge or question facts that you might be laying down, but they can't really challenge your personal experience. And then I guess the last thing I'll share is that one of the members of our group has a very concrete plan. He's going to be giving a workshop for another group he's involved with, I think within like a week, on these concepts. And he offered to share a resource sheet that he's pulled together. So if he hasn't already, you know who you are, you can throw that in the chat.
Thank you so much. That brings up two really good things. The first is that Chris asks so many questions, and so many good ones. So if people need some tips on how to ask people really good questions about themselves, find that guy on Twitter. And the other thing is that for the past two sessions, and for this session, and for the two webinars coming up, there's a page for it on Climate Justice Edmonton's website, climatejusticeedmonton.com. And we're going to post not just the video recording links when they get edited, but also the resource lists that the facilitators used to gain the perspectives that they're bringing. And we're also posting things like podcast episodes and videos that people liked or responded well to. So depending on which way you like to learn, there's so many different ways to find out a little bit more. How about a report back from Bronwyn?
Hey everyone. Yeah, definitely a lot of really similar themes. I think we stayed mostly in the meta and didn't and talked more about like what we have found are like good ways of convincing and good tools for convincing people. But yeah, so definitely talked about trying to find common ground, and that ultimately most people have like some of the same core values and can just have very different explanations of how we get like how we help people or how we solve problems. So one person had an example of someone they volunteer with kind of supporting homeless folks, where they are both very concerned about people in their community, but then politically have like very different ways around like how society writ large should help homeless people. And so believing that austerity and like cuts would actually be the thing that help. And so yeah, like trying to use that common ground, trying to really lean into like personal experiences and personal stories, both because they're like harder to refute and get angry at, and so it can help de-escalate, and also because they're the things that people like remember and like connect most with emotionally. Yeah, and then we ended up talking about how we feel like things are feel really polarized right now. So it both feels like there's a lot of hope and a lot of people getting on the same page because of things like the Green New Deal, but also obviously things on the right feel really bad. So we'll see which one wins.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a really challenging conversation, but a good one. Let's hear from Stephen.
Sure. Yeah. So I think we kind of talked about like a lot of things that have already been mentioned. You know, we kind of focused a lot about like as we're having these conversations, like making sure that we're like, you know, holding the person that we're talking to with like a lot of empathy, and just making sure that we're, you know, like I think as Paige said earlier, like meeting people where they're at. And just like keeping it really positive, you know, making sure that, you know, it doesn't get out of control heated. But like, you know, disagreement, yeah, will definitely happen. But making sure that the disagreement doesn't leave people in a way where they, you know, will never agree with you again. And, you know, where they will not come back. Yeah, and I think also too, like we kind of talked a little bit about like assessing the relationship that you have with the people that you want to speak to.
Good.
You know, just making sure that like, you know, this might not be a conversation that is very productive, just to walk up to someone and say, hey, like eco-fascism sucks. It might be a lot for people to chew on all in one moment. But if it's, you know, friends or family, that know you well, or that you've, you know, had some maybe easier conversations with, you know, broaching that topic of why, you know, the lifeboat theory is bad, you know, might be easier with people who you've already had a few conversations with. Yeah, and Ray also noted the kitchen table convos and the tools that they provide for having conversations. So yeah.
Yeah, empathy first. Chen? Did Chen have a breakout group? Oh, well, I will
Sorry,
go through. Oh, no.
I was just muting myself. Sorry. I think apart from what folks have mentioned, one of our group members talked about the importance of using language that is accessible, avoiding academic jargons. I think they mentioned an example of neoliberalism as a concept that might be less accessible to folks who may not necessarily have a, you know, access or resource to read academic articles and so on and so forth. And another thing I think one of our group members mentioned was the importance to present to folks in conversations that alternative examples exist. Because most of the times, people accept the reality as if that's the only way to go. I think having the knowledge and I think outlook, or providing examples of just say, look at this thing happened in this way here, is really important when we engage in the process that we bring in people in, and also realizing that this does not achieve in one conversation, and there needs to be maybe consecutive, but also consistent care and engagement in that relationship.
Yeah. Is there anyone else who had a discussion group? I had one, and we talked about a lot of the same things as everyone else, but we specifically focused on being in families that are kind of oil and gas families and the challenges that come with having those conversations in a compassionate manner. And one thing that came up as an opportunity within that, beyond the normal ways that we talk about reframing people's relationship with work and with oil economies, was that we're in a really unique time right now, and a lot of people are changing their worldviews on a lot of things. A lot of people are feeling kind of some different feelings and having different thoughts than they've had before, and so this can be an opportunity to open up a conversation in that realm, not just in when we're talking about public health and stuff like that. So I think the next slide has some next steps. On Thursday, as usual, we are having a casual conversation. I think we're doing another office hours type thing. Last week was really joyful and a beautiful opportunity for community. So everyone is so much more than welcome to come through with that. Chris has just posted a link to the Casual Convo event page on Facebook. You can also, so you can RSVP for that. You'll get a reminder about it. The next new Green New Deal webinar is next Monday. It's super exciting. We're talking about building power. So it'll take everything that we've done in the past 4 weeks, but even if you've got people that are interested in that and who haven't been on the latest sessions, they can catch up on the ones that are posted online. But they can also, you can also just show up for this one. It's about how we think about the people's power and what we're going to do to get a Green New Deal, even though we aren't in government and we don't have all of the money that the capitalists do. So we also are going to have, like I said, the reading list will be on our website. And the next time we have a newsletter, we'll probably include a little bit about that. So you can find out more if you follow us on social media. We will post as well with when the Zoom links are up, and also reminders about the next webinars we've got. So does anyone have any outstanding questions or feedback or things that I missed? Danielle has a question.
I don't have a question. I was just going to follow up on the question regarding that Noah had regarding some of the things that I said during my portion. So what I was referring to, so he had just asked about the comments I made in regards to immigration and CERB and immigration status. So I will admit that I did not update based on the most recent changes that may have been made, so it may have been a little bit out of date as well. But what I was talking about was like there's concerns about ability to prove like the $5,000 and up income and like barriers around that. I can put some links. I'm sorry I have to run again about my roof. And then the other question was just in regards to the long-term effects to employment status, and just like if temporary workers have status that's based on the employer that they have at that time, disruption to that could potentially have an impact on their employment or on their immigration status if they're a temporary employer. So that's what I was referring to. So my apologies for the lack of clarity there.
No, it's good. And actually that's like super, like I hadn't even thought of that. So thank you.
It was a really good question, Noah. All right. Anything else? Well, in that case, I'm so happy that everyone was here today. Please stay tuned on our social media and sign up for our newsletter. I have a lot of fun making it, so I'm really happy that so many people read it according to MailChimp. And we'll be in touch, and I'll see you all on Thursday/Monday. And that's really cool.